July 17, 2014, eastern Ukraine, 33,000 feet. Below that altitude, a war zone. Above it, safe. That was the rule. 298 people were flying above the line. A missile that could reach 70,000 feet did not care about the line. 3 days earlier, a military transport had been shot down at 21,000 feet. Proof the weapons had changed. The airspace stayed open. 160 flights crossed the same corridor the day before. MH17 followed every rule in the book. The rules were wrong. The flight was also marketed as KLM-4103, a code share. Some passengers had booked through the Dutch airline, never knowing they would board a Malaysian aircraft. 80 of the 298 were children. At least 20 were entire families traveling together. 6 were delegates to an international AIDS conference. Among them, one of the most influential HIV researchers alive. None of them had any say in the route. None of them knew a war was being fought beneath their seats. And none of them knew that 3 days earlier, the weapons in that war had already proven they could reach higher than the rules admitted. Why was the deadliest aircraft shoot-down in aviation history allowed to happen? This is the story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, a Boeing 777 carrying 283 passengers and 15 crew from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. It is not the story of a pilot error. It is not the story of a mechanical failure. Every person in that cockpit did everything right. The aircraft was airworthy. The route was approved. The altitude was authorized. And yet, on a Thursday afternoon in July, all 298 people on board ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. Because somewhere in the system, between a war on the ground and a sky full of airliners, a line had been drawn at the wrong altitude, and no one moved it in time. To understand how that happened, the story has to begin not in the cockpit of MH17, but in the months before it ever took off, in a conflict that was escalating faster than the rules could keep up. In early 2014, Ukraine was tearing itself apart. The Euromaidan protests had forced out the country's pro-Russian president, and Russia had responded by annexing Crimea. But the crisis did not stop there. In the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, pro-Russian separatists seized government buildings, declared independent republics, and launched an armed rebellion against Kiev. And they were not alone. From the very beginning, Russia supplied them. Money, weapons, volunteers, and according to multiple investigations, active duty soldiers disguised as civilians. The Ukrainian military fought back. Its air force flew strike missions and transport runs over the conflict zone. Helicopters at low altitude, jets higher up. And because of that air support, the separatists needed anti-aircraft weapons. At first, they used man-portable systems, shoulder-fired missiles called man-pads, capable of reaching a few thousand feet, enough to threaten helicopters, enough to hit a low-flying transport, but not enough to touch anything at cruising altitude. Except the threat was already changing. On June 14th, a month before MH17, separatists had shot down a Ukrainian Air Force Ilyushin IL-76 military transport as it approached Luhansk airport. All 49 people on board were killed. That aircraft was hit at low altitude, within manpad range, so the shoot-down did not trigger a reassessment of the threat ceiling. But it proved something important. The separatists were actively targeting aircraft, and they were getting better at it. Then came the week before MH17. On July 14th, 3 days before the disaster, a Ukrainian AN-26 transport was hit while flying at approximately 6,500 meters, roughly 21,000 feet. That was well above manpad range. Something more powerful had reached it. The weapon was never conclusively identified at the time, but the altitude alone should have been a warning. Whatever the separatists were firing, it could now reach higher than anyone on the ground had publicly acknowledged. And that distinction mattered, because it was the basis of a decision that would define everything that followed. The Ukrainian authorities issued a series of notices to airmen, NOTAMs, restricting the airspace over the conflict zone, first below 26,000 feet. Then, on July 14th, after a Ukrainian military An-26 transport was shot down at roughly 21,000 feet, the restriction was raised to 32,000 feet. Above that line, the sky was declared safe for civilian traffic. 160 commercial flights crossed that corridor on July 16th. Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, Singapore Airlines. The airway was called L980, and it was one of the most efficient routes between Europe and Southeast Asia. Every airline that used it was following international guidelines. Every crew that flew it had been cleared by air traffic control. The system said it was safe. On the morning of July 17th, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 pushed back from Gate G3 at Amsterdam Schiphol, 13 minutes behind schedule. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9 Mike Romeo Delta, with more than 76,000 flight hours on the airframe. It had been inspected, fueled, and loaded with 283 passengers bound for Kuala Lumpur. Among them, families heading home to Malaysia, a group of delegates traveling to an international AIDS conference in Melbourne, and a Dutch senator. In the cockpit, Captain Wan Amran Wan Hussein, 49 years old, over 13,000 flight hours, nearly 8,000 on the 777, ran through the departure sequence with First Officer Ahmad Hakimi Hanapi, a younger pilot still building time on the type. Two relief crew members, Captain Eugene Chu and First Officer Mohammed Firdaus, were aboard for the long-haul rotation, likely resting somewhere behind the cockpit door. The aircraft lifted off at 12:31 local time and climbed toward its planned cruise altitude, flight level 330, 33,000 feet, 1,000 feet above the restricted zone. Back on the ground, something else was in motion. That same day, civilian witnesses near the Russian-Ukrainian border watched a convoy of military vehicles cross into separatist-held territory. On one of the flatbeds sat a weapons system that no threat assessment had accounted for, a launcher capable of reaching 70,000 feet. It was heading south, toward a farmer's field outside the town of Snizhne, directly beneath airway L980. No NOTAM was issued. No airspace was closed. The crew of MH17 had no reason to think anything was different about this Thursday. But below them, the rules had already stopped applying. To understand why what was on that flatbed changed everything, you need to know what a Buk missile system is. NATO calls it the Gadfly. The Soviet Union built it as a mobile, radar-guided surface-to-air missile platform, designed to track and destroy fast-moving military targets at extreme altitude. Each missile is 5 meters long, weighs 690 kilograms, and can reach targets as high as 70,000 feet. That is more than twice the cruising altitude of any commercial airliner. The system includes its own radar, its own command vehicle, and multiple launchers, all mounted on tracked armored carriers. It was built for a professional military with trained crews, a clear chain of command, and strict identification procedures. In the right hands, it is a precision weapon. In the wrong hands, it cannot tell the difference between a fighter jet and a Boeing 777. The version now sitting on separatist-held soil was a Buk M1, not a Cold War relic, but a modernized system still in active service with the Russian military. Investigators would later trace it to Russia's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, based in Kursk. But on this Thursday afternoon, it was positioned in a field near Snizhne, operated by a mixed crew of Russian personnel and separatist fighters. Men who were neither fully trained on the system nor supervised by any functioning command structure. That matters, because the Buk has procedures specifically designed to prevent what was about to happen. Before firing, the crew is supposed to verify the target using identification friend or foe signals, IFF. MH17's transponder was active and broadcasting its identity to any system capable of receiving it. The crew is supposed to contact higher command for authorization, and the crew is supposed to cross-check against publicly available commercial flight schedules. A Boeing 777 broadcasting on a known airway at a known altitude would have been immediately identifiable as a civilian aircraft. But none of those steps were taken. No IFF check, no command authorization, no schedule review. In the chaos of the battlefield, the crew was making its own decisions. Meanwhile, 33,000 feet above them, the flight was proceeding exactly as planned. As MH17 crossed into the Dnipropetrovsk flight information region, Dnipro Control asked the crew whether they were ready to climb to flight level 350, as originally filed. At the same time, another aircraft, Singapore Airlines Flight 351, also a Boeing 777, was flying the same airway at the same altitude, just 33 kilometers behind. To maintain separation, one of them had to climb. The crew of MH17 requested to stay at flight level 330. Dnipro Control approved and sent the Singapore flight up to 350 instead. A few minutes later, the crew requested a minor deviation, about 20 nautical miles to the left, to avoid weather. Routine. Approved. Then they asked to climb to flight level 340. That request was denied. Another aircraft was already at that altitude. So MH17 stayed where it was, 33,000 feet, right on the line. In the cabin behind them, the flight was deep into its mid-cruise rhythm. Window shades were drawn. Meal trays had been collected. Some passengers were sleeping. Others were watching films on the seatback screens. The cabin crew moved quietly through the aisles. For everyone behind the cockpit door, this was the uneventful middle of a long-haul flight. The hours that passed without anyone noticing. No one felt anything unusual. No one heard anything unusual. The aircraft was stable, the engine steady, the sky outside a flat, featureless blue. But far below, on a dirt road in separatist-held territory, the Buk launcher had reached its position. An Associated Press journalist in the nearby town of Snizhne would later report seeing the system, a large, tracked vehicle with its missile rail raised, escorted by 2 civilian cars, and operated by a man in unfamiliar fatigues, speaking with a distinctly Russian accent. The launcher was in a farmer's field, pointed skyward, its radar already scanning. It sat directly beneath one of the busiest commercial air corridors in the region, and nobody on airway L980 knew it was there. At 16:19 local time, Dnipro Control noticed the flight had drifted 3.6 nautical miles off the airway centerline, a residual effect of the weather deviation, and asked the crew to return to track. The crew acknowledged. 1 minute later, Ukrainian controllers contacted Russian air traffic control in Rostov-on-Don to arrange the handoff. Permission was granted. Dnipro Control called MH17 with the new frequency. No reply. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, consider subscribing. There is much more to this story, and the part that matters most is still ahead. They called again. No reply. Dnipro Control called Rostov back and asked if they could still see the aircraft on radar. The answer came quickly. The target was gone. What had happened was this. Sometime around 1615, the Buk's radar had picked up a contact, a dot on a screen, high altitude, heading east-southeast. The radar showed speed, bearing, altitude. It did not show an airline name. It did not show a flight number. It did not show 298 people. Just a blip requiring a decision. The crew did not verify. The crew did not call for authorization. They pushed the button. The missile ignites. It accelerates past the speed of sound within seconds, climbing at over 2,000 miles per hour toward the nose of a Boeing 777. If the pilots see anything at all, they see it for less than 2 seconds. There is no time to react. No way for a wide-body jet to evade a weapon designed to intercept fighter aircraft. At 16:20 and 3 seconds local time, the missile's proximity fuse detonates the warhead just above and to the left of the cockpit. It does not need to make contact. It is designed to explode close enough to shred whatever is nearby. Over 800 high-energy fragments, including distinctively shaped bow tie and cube shrapnel, tear through the forward fuselage at extreme velocity. The cockpit is destroyed instantly. Captain Juan, First Officer Ahmad, and a flight purser who had been in the cockpit are killed immediately. Several business-class passengers are likely killed in the same moment. The nose section separates from the aircraft. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder both stop at 13:20 and 3 seconds UTC. In the last 20 milliseconds of the cockpit voice recording, 2 sharp sound peaks are captured, then nothing. The forward fuselage, now torn open, begins to tumble. The decompression at 33,000 feet is instantaneous. Investigators later concluded that the remaining passengers would have lost consciousness within seconds. The Dutch safety board did not believe anyone was aware of what was happening to them. The main fuselage, wings still attached, continues forward, unstable, uncontrolled. Structural failures cascade. The wingtips shear off. The tail section twists and separates. The middle section, loaded with fuel, eventually impacts a farmer's field, inverted, and the fuel ignites on contact. Wreckage scatters across 50 square kilometers of eastern Ukraine. The line at 32,000 feet, the one that was supposed to keep everyone safe, had meant nothing at all. On military radar screens in the region, controllers watched what appeared to be multiple small objects descending. No other aircraft, civilian or military, was within 30 to 60 kilometers of the site. On the ground, local residents, people who lived in a war zone and were used to hearing explosions, saw burning debris falling from the sky. They assumed it was military wreckage. Then they started finding windbreakers, handbags, passports, the belongings of 298 people who had boarded a routine flight that morning and never arrived. Singapore Airlines Flight 351, the other Boeing 777, the one that had climbed to flight level 350 just minutes earlier, was 33 kilometers away when MH17 disappeared from radar. Air India Flight 113, a Boeing 787 flying from Delhi to Birmingham, was approximately 25 kilometers behind. Both aircraft were immediately rerouted. Within hours, Ukraine closed the airspace over the conflict zone entirely, from the surface to unlimited altitude. The restriction that had been set at 32,000 feet for months was gone in a single evening. It took less than 90 minutes to do what should have been done weeks earlier. 6 days later, the first coffins arrived at Eindhoven Air Base in the Netherlands aboard a Dutch C-130 Hercules. Bells tolled across the country. Flags hung at half-mast. A column of hearses stretched along the highway from Eindhoven to a military barracks in Hilversum, where the identification process would begin. Of the 298 on board, 296 would eventually be identified. 2 never were. The investigation was led by the Dutch Safety Board, the DSB, because the Netherlands had lost 193 citizens, the largest national group on board. A separate criminal inquiry was launched by the Joint Investigation Team, the JIT, comprising investigators from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia, and Ukraine. Russia offered to participate, but was excluded due to concerns about impartiality, and those concerns would prove well-founded. The crash site was a vast debris field in the middle of an active war zone, initially controlled by separatist forces who blocked international observers from entering. Reports emerged of looting, tampering, and wreckage being carried away. When the United Nations Security Council attempted to pass a resolution demanding unrestricted access and an independent investigation, Russia vetoed it. Once access was finally secured, investigators transported the debris to the Gilze Rijgen Air Force Base in the Netherlands. There, they undertook one of the most meticulous aircraft reconstructions in the history of aviation investigation. Each fragment was photographed, catalogued, and traced back to its location on the airframe. Slowly, they rebuilt the forward fuselage and cockpit, and what it revealed eliminated every alternative explanation. The flight data recorder showed no abnormalities before the recording stopped. Engine parameters were normal. The cockpit voice recorder contained no warnings, no alerts, no crew discussion of any onboard problem. There was no bomb residue, no internal detonation pattern. The damage was entirely external, hundreds of puncture marks on the left side of the cockpit, each consistent with high-energy fragments entering from a single point ahead and to the left of the aircraft. Investigators hung strings from each impact hole and traced them backward. Every string converged at the same origin, and embedded in the cockpit walls, in the forward fuselage, and in the bodies of the pilots were fragments of a very specific shape, bow tie and cube-shaped shrapnel, made from a distinct metal composition. 3 large pieces of the missile itself were recovered from the debris field, including sections of the tail. All 3 were conclusively identified as belonging to a 9M38 series missile, a variant used exclusively in the Buk system. The warhead type was confirmed as a 9N314M, the only warhead that produces that particular shrapnel signature. The JIT, working alongside the DSB, then traced the weapon itself. Investigative journalists at Bellingcat, using open-source intelligence, civilian photographs, social media posts, satellite imagery, tracked the Buk launcher's route from its base in Kursk, Russia, across the border into Ukraine, through separatist-held towns, to the field near Snizhne. Civilian videos placed the launcher in separatist territory on the day of the shootdown. Intercepted communications revealed separatist fighters discussing what they believed was a successful hit on a Ukrainian military transport. conversations that abruptly changed tone when they realized the debris was civilian. And that night, the launcher was observed moving back toward the Russian border, with one of its 4 missiles missing. Russia launched a series of contradictory counter-narratives almost immediately. Some claimed Ukrainian fighter jets had shot down the plane. Others blamed a Ukrainian Buk system. The Russian Ministry of Defense released satellite images, purporting to show Ukrainian launchers in the area. But analysts quickly determined the images had been digitally altered. The metadata and shadow angles did not match the claimed locations. Against the fog of propaganda, the physical evidence was overwhelming. The debris pattern, the missile fragments, the shrapnel composition, the reconstruction, the open-source trail. Every line of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. MH17 was destroyed by a 9M38 missile fired from a Buk system operated by Russian-backed separatists, launched from a field in territory they controlled. But the investigation revealed something beyond who fired the missile. It revealed why the missile had a target to hit in the first place. The NOTAM restricting airspace below flight level 320 had been issued on July 14th. The same day, a Ukrainian An-26 was shot down at roughly 21,000 feet. That shootdown proved the weapons in the conflict zone had already exceeded manpad range. It should have triggered a fundamental reassessment. Instead, the restriction was raised from 26,000 to 32,000 feet, a ceiling based on the assumption that no weapon in separatist hands could reach higher. That assumption was wrong by 38,000 feet. The Buk could reach 70,000. And there were other signals. The day before MH17, on July 16th, Russia itself had issued NOTAMs for its own adjacent airspace, one restricting flights below 32,000 feet, and another restricting flights below 53,000 feet. That second restriction would have closed the airspace to virtually all commercial traffic at cruising altitude. But Malaysian Airlines' automated flight planning system did not flag it. The reason Russia set a higher ceiling for its own airspace, while the corridor next door remained open at 32,000 feet, was never fully explained. When the Dutch Safety Board asked, Russian authorities said it was to create agreement with the adjoining Ukrainian airspace. But the two ceilings did not agree, and the higher Russian restriction implicitly acknowledged a threat that the Ukrainian restriction did not. The question that followed was whether anyone in a position of authority had known, before July 17th, that weapons capable of reaching cruising altitude were present in the conflict zone. The Flight Safety Foundation, in an independent inquiry published in 2021, concluded that Ukrainian counterintelligence services had received their first information hinting at a Buk launcher in separatist hands on July 14th, the same day the An-26 was shot down, the same day the NOTAM was raised to flight level 320. But that information was never verified, never passed to the authorities responsible for airspace security risk assessment, and never acted upon. The inquiry also found that no uniform international practice existed for states to close their own airspace when there were indicators of a high-altitude threat. Of 16 conflict zones studied over the previous 25 years, only 2 had seen a sovereign state fully close its own airspace. The system was not built for a scenario where a country at war would voluntarily shut down a revenue-generating corridor based on unverified intelligence about a weapon that might or might not be present. And so, the corridor stayed open. Not because anyone decided it was safe, but because no one had a clear mandate or a clear incentive to decide it was not. Meanwhile, Ukraine continued to collect overflight fees for every commercial aircraft that crossed its airspace. The airway L980 was one of the busiest corridors in the region. Closing it would have cost money and disrupted traffic across an entire continent. The DSB would later conclude that there had been sufficient reason to close the airspace completely, but no one did. In November 2022, a Dutch court convicted 3 men in absentia, 2 Russians, Igor Girkin and Sergei Dubinsky, and 1 Ukrainian separatist, Leonid Karchenko, of murdering all 298 people on board. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court also ruled that Russia exercised effective control over the separatist forces at the time. A 4th suspect, Oleg Pulatov, was acquitted. None of the convicted men are in custody. Then, in May 2025, the Council of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, voted that Russia had failed its obligations under international aviation law. It was one of the first times the global aviation body had formally attributed responsibility for the destruction of a civilian aircraft to a specific state. Russia appealed the decision to the International Court of Justice in September of the same year. 2 months earlier, in July 2025, the European Court of Human Rights ruled unanimously that Russia was responsible for the downing of MH17 and for the deaths of everyone on board. The legal reckoning is still unfolding, but the facts have not changed since the DSB hung those strings in a hangar in the Netherlands and watched them all point to the same place. The changes that followed MH17 reshaped how the world thinks about conflict zones and civilian airspace. Airlines formed internal risk teams and began working with intelligence agencies for real-time threat assessments. ICAO developed new frameworks for evaluating overflight risk, frameworks that did not exist in July 2014. Several carriers stopped flying over conflict zones entirely, even when the airspace was technically open. And when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the airspace above the country was closed permanently. But none of that happened fast enough for the 298 people on MH17. The line at 32,000 feet was supposed to be a wall between war and routine. It was drawn by people who believed the weapons on the ground could not reach the aircraft above. On July 14, 2014, that belief was tested and failed. The airspace stayed open. On July 17th, a Boeing 777 flew 1,000 feet above a line that had already been proven meaningless. Today, that line no longer exists. The airspace above eastern Ukraine is closed from the surface to unlimited. It took 298 people to erase it. If this story stays with you, consider sharing it. And if you want to understand another case where the system failed before the cockpit did, the next video is already waiting for you.